And these folks actually made some headway. They never elected a president, but their view that the government needs to be for the people was pretty effective. They managed to get the Democratic Party to focus in on the fact that farmers, that workers were simply being eviscerated by corporations, big farming corporations, big mining corporations, oil, railroads. All of them were making a lot of money, and part of the way they were making the money by keeping wages low for the workers. Now, even though the populists couldn't elect their own presidential candidate, and they elected a couple of congressmen and some governors and so on and so forth, that was great. But that party disappeared after the 1896 presidential election. It felt as if there was this conservative swing going on in the country, that the ideas of the populist movement and the Democratic Party that had listened to them had been defeated at the ballot box, and nobody wanted to have anything to do with this idea of a government becoming more involved in the economy, regulating wages, working conditions, railroad prices, housing. This idea seemed like it was just dead and gone after the presidential elections of the 1890s that brought the Republicans to power and destroyed the Democrats. But it didn't go away. And it didn't go away for a variety of reasons. And one of them was that people were tired. Labor was tired of working more and more hours without seeing any overtime, getting fired for the first moment of complaint. Working conditions were unsafe. There was no unemployment insurance. When you retired, there was no pension. It didn't matter how much you worked. You were either going to be poor while you were working, or certainly you were going to be poor when you retired because you were too old and infirm to work. Women were tired. Women were now working. Increasingly, they had education. Of course, I'm talking about white women, not blacks or immigrant women. And so, with this added wealth, not wealth, but disposable income, this ability to go out on their own more and more because it was socially acceptable. You didn't have to be accompanied by a parent or your older brother or whatever the case may be, or a date. There was this increasing sense of things are changing, but we still don't have the one thing that everyone else has in a democracy which matters: the vote. People that own small businesses, they were also tired because they saw corporations monopolizing their particular area of industry, government protecting big business, and small businesses were just being eaten up. So even people that had a comfortable middle-class lifestyle were being eaten up by the capitalist marketplace. No matter how hard they worked, paid their taxes, obeyed the rules, all that kind of stuff. So the progressive era was essentially the rebellion of the people that were simply tired of being taken for a ride by government. It started with the populist movement. It started with the Knights of Labor, who started pushing back at a government that didn't want to get involved in labor, social relations, education, the economy. In the progressive era, all these people came together. Labor organizers, women's rights advocates, intellectuals that had an interest in social reform and they had studied other forms of how to improve society. Responsible businessmen who actually believed you should pay workers a decent wage. All these people came together in the progressive era, and most importantly, presidents were now campaigning on the promise that government's got to do something for the people. It just can't hang out and do nothing. So, this is essentially what I just talked about. So what's going on? What is going on in this time that eventually forces government to get involved and to regulate society a bit more? Besides the fact that the Depression is over, all right? The Depression is over. By 1900, That depression that I talked about in the last class and the class before that, the depression that had mobilized workers to become unionized, that had mobilized farmers to become organized, that's over. So corporations are making money. The factories are expanding. People are moving to the cities to take advantage of this urban work. But as more and more of these people move to the cities, increasing segregation. It becomes more and more obvious that if you are a member of the working class, you're going to be stuck there, and so are your kids for the rest of your life. Because no matter how hard you work, there's never enough work. There's never enough money for you to make to save for the next generation. You just don't get paid enough. And you can't unionize because the government doesn't recognize that. And they'll call out the cops and the military if you do. There was always a problem of people being segregated, poor and rich neighborhoods. But in the early 1900s, it became unavoidable. You had the slums of the Lower East Side, where you had recent Russian, Jewish, Polish, Italian immigrants living multiple generations of families in small apartments, and just a couple of minutes away by walk, or let's say a half-hour walk away, you have the huge mansions of Fifth Avenue, which still exist today. And so people are looking around and they're saying, there's got to be something wrong where there's this much money being made, and you could walk within 20 minutes from the poorest neighborhood to the richest neighborhood in America. Something's got to be wrong. Now, the other defining characteristic of this age, which really brought to light just how screwed up society was with no government regulation of the capitalist marketplace, was the immigrants that came in. All of these immigrants that came in, 99% of them came in because they were escaping economic and political hardship back home. All these people were coming in poor with very little education. They were immediately going into the working classes. And so this great division between the wealthy and the suffering became even more obvious. In this time, 1840 to 1924, but the biggest wave of immigrants really came at the end of the 1800s. You had 40 million immigrants. At first it was the Irish, who came over with their, at the time, strange religion, Catholicism, with their strange accents. But at least they spoke English. But even the Irish were not considered appropriate to American citizenship. They weren't smart enough. They just didn't understand the concept of voting and independence. But by the 1890s, the Irish were considered completely as quote-unquote white as every other white native citizen. Essentially assimilated. And part of the reason for that is because of the new people coming over that were even more quote-unquote different and frightening. And they weren't leaving. They were staying. They were having kids. Millions upon millions of Southern Italians, Greeks, Russians, Poles who came over didn't know the language. Most of which were not Protestant, which was the main religion of America. They were Catholics or Eastern Orthodox Christians. And that's just in the East Coast. To the south, millions of Mexican migrants going to where the jobs are in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico. In the West, the Chinese have been excluded. Legally, Chinese can't come to the country anymore, but Japanese are coming by the thousands for the work. So, you have a huge expansion in this visibly different but also incredibly poor population, which generates thinking of, what do we do about this? How do we make all of these folks a part of America and raise all their living standards? Another major characteristic of this era is the emergence of consumption society, which is what you and I are living in right now. Let me see a show of hands here. Does anybody in this room have the most recent iPhone? Okay, that's a third of you. How many people in this room possess, a smartphone in general? All right, the rest of you. And I'm assuming those of you, your smartphone is not 10 years old. It's probably 2 or 3 years old. Probably because your company gave you an upgrade, stimulus or whatever. After 2 years, you get to upgrade for $50 if you just sign a contract, etc. Even though we may not need to, we update our phones. Even if our phone's working perfectly well, we update our phone. Why? Because on some level, whether it's subconscious or very conscious, we don't want to be the person with the old model. Why? Because the old model didn't, possibly there's a fear that this shows us as maybe we're not into it, we're not paying attention to what everyone else is doing, modern trends, maybe we can't afford it, we want to keep up, all right? This is a manufactured feeling. If your phone works, you can check your email and make a phone call, why the hell do you need the most updated phone? You don't, but you are taught to. Because we live in a consumption society. Consumption, and I don't mean eating, but the consumption of goods made in factories makes us feel good. It is part of our identity. This wasn't always the case. When did it become the case? In the early 20th century, when the factories started turning out stuff that was much less expensive than before, and much more available to a working class that, as bad as they were being treated, they had more money than when they were living back home in Italy or Japan or Mexico or in the countryside. They had some money to at least have some of these consumption goods. Plus, there was an expanding middle class. As a consequence, in the early 20th century, you see the development of things that every house now feels you need to have if you are going to be the new normal. The new normal is everyone needs to have a sewing machine. They've invented sewing machines. Why are we still sewing by hand? If you're still sewing by hand, clearly you don't have enough money to buy a sewing machine. It's a status symbol. So now everyone's got to have a sewing machine. Vacuum cleaners. They've been invented. First the wealthy have them in the middle classes. Increasingly they become a staple of every home. Washing machines. Once they invented that, it became a sign of poverty and lower class status if you were still doing your laundry by hand only. All of this stuff becomes status symbols because the prices have come down and people now start to consume and they become markers of their identity. As a consequence, you also see the expansion of things like department stores. The big department stores we have in the city, Macy's, etc., they got their start in the early 20th century. Because if everyone's buying all this stuff, why not stick it in the same place? One big store, multiple levels. What if you can't get to the store? That's when you get the invention of the catalogs, where you just look through the catalog and you mail in your check and then people mail you your stuff in the middle of the countryside. U.S. Postal Service goes everywhere. Other things that develop at this time, mass leisure. People are in fact making enough money working in the cities. It's not a lot, but it's enough that they find things to do at late night or on the weekend. So now you also have the expansion of things like dance halls, public dance halls, essentially the clubs of today, but much bigger. The first theaters, movies, like for a nickel. You go in and watch like a nickel cheap movie. But most importantly, with the expansion of subway service in places like New York, people flock to Coney Island. This is a modern aerial view of Coney Island with its beaches. The beach, cheapest form of family entertainment you can have. All you got to do is get there. Well, once the subways are open, you put your family on the train, you go out there. How many people went? A whole lot. If you think Jones Beach is crowded today, on a nice summer day, this is what you would expect at Coney Island on a regular basis in the early 20th century. There isn't a whole lot of place here to hang out. You'll also notice that most of these folks, 99% of them are white. Because you need money to get out here. Right? If you're poor, you're working. You're not hanging out on the beach on a Sunday. And there is a significant class and gender and, race and gender differential between those that are working and have made enough just to have enough to do this, and those that are just simply still working and working. Another major consequence of this era was the increasing public presence of women in urban spaces, white women. In this era, the idea that women should only be in the home, that respectable women are only in the home, they work, they raise their kids, and the only thing that they do outside the home is charitable work, which was an idea from 100 years earlier, that is finally done for. Because women are now working in these department stores. They're increasingly working in the expanding government bureaucracies as secretaries and clerks and so on and so forth. Before women, the only job they could do outside the home was teachers. Even nursing was a male-dominated profession up until the American Civil War. But now women are working in these white-collar jobs. They have their own money, they're out on their own more, and it's a much more open environment for white, middle and lower middle class women. But this obviously does not extend to black women. Most black women are still working in the South in agriculture. This idea of a burgeoning women's movement from women who have more money and a little bit more education is really confined to white women now. So why should we even talk about it? Because it is these women that are pushing for the right to vote that they eventually get in a couple of decades. And once you get that, then it becomes increasingly impossible to deny it to black women. These things, America happens in stages, unfortunately. Now, this is also the era of Fordism, the assembly line. Really, at this point, the skilled worker is done. There was a time in this country, before the Industrial Revolution, where you could be an apprentice, you got a skill, and then, once you became a master craftsman, you can control the production, the rate, and the training within your field. And we have a little bit of this today, but mostly all manufacturing is now done purely on the assembly line, where you take one person's years of training and you break it down to a bunch of smaller skills, which you hire people to do along the assembly line. The guy who perfected this kind of mass production to produce lots of stuff at inexpensive prices to give to the American public was Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Motor Vehicle Company. Also a raging anti-Semite, hated Jews, because that was a common prejudice at the time. Henry Ford brought us the assembly line, the Model T car, which was the first affordable vehicle for regular people. What does all this mean, though? What does it matter that people can now get sewing machines, can now get cars, can now get record players, and in a few years it'll be radios? What does it all mean? You can only enjoy this stuff. You can only enjoy these consumer products. You can only enjoy going to Coney Island, going to a theater, going to a movie, if you have money. So then let me take a step back now. Increasingly, it is expected that those that are at least somewhat successful have the sewing machine, the car, the record player. It's expected. And if you don't, it is a marker that somehow you're poor, working class, unsuccessful. And if you are unsuccessful, no one's going to say, well, it's capitalism's fault. No, the fault is going to be you're just not working hard enough. So then what does that say about you and your character? So now many people are stuck in this catch-22 where they are expected to own the things and to do the things that show them as being successful by having enough money to buy this stuff. But no matter how hard they work, there's never enough money because they don't get paid enough. So they're screwed. They can't do anything to get themselves out of their cycle of maybe not crippling poverty, but increasingly humiliating poverty, or at least humiliating working class status. So, if being an American increasingly means not just freedom of speech, in having the vote, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, but also the ability to enjoy the benefits of an expanding American market, the freedom to be a consumer, at a certain point, people can ask the question, well, who controls how much I get paid? Who controls that? Yeah. Well, I don't vote for a corporation, but I vote for a government. Who should be helping me out of my problem? The government. Now you start seeing, beginning in 1900, the explosion of labor unionizing. Remember, at the end of the 1800s, unions had been destroyed by police, by the military, by the government, who said, no, labor cannot interfere in business by unions. Also, you have increasing criticism of corporate monopoly. Before, government would say, hey, corporations are great business people. Look at how much money they're making. They're so efficient. And they accepted low-paid, exploited workers. But now workers are saying, enough is enough. You are my government. What are you doing for me? So you have what's known as a changing idea of freedom. We have this thing in this country where we switch back and forth to what we expect from our government. In the first chapter of this class, chapter 16, when we talked about the Gilded Age, chapter 17, when we talked about farmers and workers being exploited, the idea of freedom there was, does anybody remember? What was the definition of freedom in the last couple of lectures? Does anybody remember? There's two different kinds, but what was the one that was being put into practice in the chapters before the one today? Do you remember? Well, what's the definition of freedom today to you, right now? What does it mean to you?
Choose what you want.
Right. No obstacles, right? But do you have the same choices as someone who has more money, education, connections than you do? No. Right? Go ahead.
Was it negative?
Yeah, negative freedom, meaning do not place any obstacles to the choices I make, which benefited corporations and the wealthy because they could hire, fire, whatever they wanted. They could operate any way they wanted. But increasingly at the turn of the 20th century, there's a positive view of what government should do, what's known as positive freedom. That the only way to escape economic slavery is the government got to get involved in the economy. Because like I've said a million times before, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly means nothing if you're starving. Right? And that's increasingly what people are focusing on now in the early 20th century. We're now, today, in a period where negative freedom is coming back into play, which is the government's got to get its hands out of my pocket, no more taxes, and don't tell me what to do. Except it's complicated now because, you know, the Republicans, for instance, they want to reduce taxes, but they want to tell you how to live your life socially, regulating your behavior. Back then, it was a bit more easy. The Republicans were just like, government, don't get involved in anything. Now, a clear sign that people were transforming from being tired to pissed off was the emergence of the American Socialist Party, which by 1912 had 150,000 actual members paying dues to the party, like membership fees. That doesn't account for all the people that were sympathetic to socialism. What is socialism? This guy is Eugene Debs, former railway worker who was the head of the socialist movement. Well, socialism is pretty straightforward. Private property, free market capitalism is simply bad. Private property means some people have more, most people don't have it. and they work for the people that have private property. And so you have economic discrepancy. And governments favor the rich, not the poor. So you have to eliminate capitalism. You have to eliminate private ownership, and the state owns everything and distributes it fairly for everyone. When I say it like this, obviously it sounds a little cuckoo. No, it doesn't. Yes, but remember, this is at a time before socialism was put into place by Joseph Stalin of Russia and Fidel Castro and the Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam. Before communism and socialism was put into place, you had people that were simply upset that capitalism meant I'm stuck being poor as well as my children for the rest of our existence. And socialism says, well, there's another way of living. Capitalism is not ingrained into the American psyche. It just has been for the past couple of hundred years. There's another way of going. And 150,000 people paid money to listen to this and spread these ideas. Now, their reforms were both radical but also kind of regular. For instance, free college education. The socialists said, you want a real democracy? Give everybody free college education so they know who the hell they're voting for and they can hold government accountable. You want to keep governments unaccountable? Keep people ignorant. People don't know what the hell they're voting for, they're probably not going to vote because they think it doesn't matter. Democrats, Republicans, they're all the same. Well, they're not. They might sound the same, they might all have the same sex scandals, but the Democratic Party and the Republican Party back then and today actually stand for different things. One will preserve your Social Security, one will not. One will tell you whom you can marry, the others will not, etc., etc., etc. And then you choose depending on what's important to you. Now, what else? The socialists were pushing for laws to improve work conditions. They also called for what the populace called for. Government needs to own the railroads because the railroad companies are simply screwing the common working man. Now, the socialists were an incredibly broad-thinking group of people. They organized farmers out west. They organized city workers. They didn't care what religion you belonged to. They were a broad-thinking people who argued what divides us is mostly the rich versus the poor. You solve that problem and you will solve racism and you will solve gender discrimination. You may or may not agree with that, but that's what they argued, and a lot of people followed. Another sign of growing labor militancy was the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. Remember, this was the more moderate labor group that at the end of the 1800s decided to stop with the strikes, stop with the violence, just organize skilled workers and try to cooperate with employers to sort of come to a mutual understanding of better wages. Because they recognized the AFL in the late 1800s, you go on strike, the government's sending out the army, and then your members die. So they tried a different tack. Even this more moderate group exploded in membership. They tripled their numbers at this time. All those workers that didn't want to join the Socialist Party and abandon capitalism just joined the AFL, if they had the skills, and they were white, because the AFL didn't organize black workers. But the biggest sign that workers were just pissed off, and they were just tired of peacefully going on strike and waiting for somebody to do something, was the emergence of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. This group was about as impatient as you could get. They believed you form strong unions, doesn't matter if it's skilled or unskilled. You bring together as many workers as possible, because in a union there is strength in numbers. And then you go on strike. everybody marches out. And if the employers send in whatever, thugs or the police or whatever, you fight back. And the point is to just make it as impossible as possible, to make it impossible for employers to ignore you and to keep on doing business. You go on strike, you surround the factory, and you make sure nobody crosses the picket line, and you shut down the factory. Violence was usually the result of when these guys got involved, and not always successfully. Sometimes the government won, and there were massacres of workers. But sometimes the IWW wins, and they force the exception in individual industries of reduced work hours, better working conditions, and so on and so forth. But maybe the most important thing the IWW did was that every time they tried to organize, they distribute pamphlets, they give speeches, they write up their newspaper, and they distribute it to their union members. Every time they tried to organize, governments and their employers try to shut them down, seize their pamphlets, arrest their leaders, break up their meetings. And this is Bale Haywood, the organizer of the IWW. What he did was brilliant. He turned around and said, a worker's right to express his grievances against capitalism is not subversive, it's not treason. It is my First Amendment right. Free speech, freedom of assembly. You may not like what I have to say, but I have a constitutional right to say it. And when you make that kind of argument, it becomes kind of impossible for people to shut you down, because eventually you'll sue, you'll go to court, and you're going to win. The IWW established in the 20th century the concept of civil liberties. Prior to the early 1900s, this idea that I have the right to freedom of speech, yes, it's in the Constitution, but nobody had really sued for it. Nobody had established a principle that you have this free. These guys said, no, I have disagreeable opinions, but I have a right to say them. And if you stop me, I will sue you. And in this country, if there's one thing you can depend on, everybody sues somebody. Feminism also emerged at this time as a new force, organizing groups of people that were simply fed up with the way things were happening. Excuse me. What do they want? The women of the 19th century, the first women's rights movement, they had a whole series of problems with contemporary society. Women couldn't own their own property, they couldn't inherit property, they couldn't go to work and keep their wages. There was no guarantee of equal education, no guarantee of equal well-paid employment. But the one that really, and forget about in the court of law. In the court of law, nowadays, if there's a family that breaks up, usually the mother is given possession of the children. Back then, it was the husband. Because remember, women didn't have control of wages. So, and there was no such thing as domestic violence. A husband hit his wife, that's a private family matter. The state doesn't get involved. Now, and there's no such thing as marital rape either, but I digress. Come to history, U.S. History Part 1 for more stories. But my point is this. Things had gotten better by 1900. I already mentioned at least white women in the cities. They were working, they were out more, they were becoming more publicly present and demanding a say in the way society would run. Increasing the demand for the vote brought these wide discrepancies of women together. But for women, there was a specific type of freedom that they were looking for. For workers, it was economic freedom. I want to work and get paid a decent wage. For women, yes, that was important. But at least for women, again, we're speaking about white women in the cities, what were they looking for beyond the vote and economic opportunity and equality? It was an end to this idea that women did not have control over their own bodies. They were still living in an era where it was acceptable for a man to go to a brothel, have sex with these random prostitutes, but any woman that had any desire, sexual yearnings at all, must be an impure woman. That was the social stigma that still existed. But this became increasingly difficult to justify when you have all these women going to work and they're out there on their own. Unchaperoned women were once considered to be, they must be prostitutes if they're walking the streets without a male partner. But now you have millions of women working. So this idea that all these women must be prostitutes, it falls by the wayside. And it leads to greater and greater discussions over sexuality. Open discussions of sexuality and who controls a woman's body. Well, the answer, of course, is women themselves. But before they would even feel entitled to have that opinion, they had to be out there, feel empowered through employment. Who helped to turn this desire for personal freedom into an organized movement? Emma Goldman, a communist. She made the argument that without birth control, we are condemning women and poor families to a cycle of poverty. Sex is natural. Everyone wants to have sex. And without birth control, you're going to have babies, which means you are dividing the family income. Birth control is illegal at this time because it is an interference with the natural, biblical procreation of the family. But her argument is control of a woman's body through birth control is not only a personal issue, it is an economic issue. If you don't make birth control legal, you are condemning any family to poverty because they can't control the number of kids they're going to have. You can't simply say, stop having sex. That doesn't work. We tried that with teenagers a generation ago. What did we get? An increase in teen pregnancies. It was measured. Now, distribution of condoms is going through the roof in New York City. And teen pregnancies go down. There's a connection. Now, the other person is Margaret Sanger. She was even more radical. She actually opened up birth control clinics to educate women about how their body worked, how to use contraception. Both of these women, simply for encouraging a discussion of sexuality, were frequently arrested. Go ahead.
Margaret Sanger, she used to work in the slums that you mentioned earlier.
Oh yes. Oh
and
yes.
That's how she became fed up because she used to go to the houses and women were dying because they were having abortions because they didn't know how to stop, becoming pregnant.
Absolutely.
So that's what made her, speak up and say. One day she just got home and after someone died in front of her, and she was just fed up. She said that she would never go back to working like that, and that's when she started speaking out.
Absolutely. Their response to being arrested frequently was the exact same as the workers' response. You don't like what I have to say, but I have a constitutional right to say it, which was undeniable in a court of law. Now, don't get me wrong. States like Connecticut still made contraception illegal up until the 1960s, and you needed a Supreme Court decision to actually allow contraception to become legal, where you can just walk into a store and buy whatever you want. I would love for us to be able to take a trip to a Duane Reade in 1965. Half the stuff you take for granted on the shelves now, it wouldn't be there. It wouldn't be there. All right. So this takes us into politics. You got all these people, labor organizers, women's rights activists that are pissed off and they're tired and they want change. And they're starting to organize. But increasingly the belief is this stuff has got to happen at a political level, at an upper level. The unions can organize down here. Women's rights activists can organize down here. But you need government up here to actually pass laws to change the way people experience their day-to-day lives. Right? So, this is progressive politics. An activist government. An activist government is exactly what I was saying earlier. A government doesn't sit back and say, I can't get involved in the economy. They jump in and they regulate wages. They regulate corporate relations with their workers. They regulate corporate relations with each other. They attack the political machines. What's a political machine? In New York City at the time, the Democratic Party pretty much controlled everything. They controlled who ran for office. They controlled the policies of the politicians when in office. And the people themselves, they voted, but they really had no control over their candidates and their politicians, because they were more dependent on the political organization of the Democratic Party in New York City to ensure that they got reelected in the future. People were feeling like their vote was useless. And of course, the progressive movement also demanded the regulation of public utilities, railroads, even the banks. All of this is known as positive freedom. The government regulating those things in society that directly affect our quality of life. Now, it all started off at the lower level, in the municipal or city governments or state governments, because it was easier there. Passing a national law that increases the size of the government is hard. But passing a city law that gives the city of New York the right to, raise taxes to build more schools, that's easy. A few dozen city councilmen is more easy to wrangle together than representatives of the entire country. So, for instance, local and state governments started raising property taxes and corporate taxes in order to pay for things for poor people or just the general public, like schools, parks, roads, community centers. Take from the wealthy, redistribute to the less wealthy to improve their quality of life. The city and the state government started banning child labor. Child labor was still legal nationally, but the individual city, town, and state governments started passing laws banning child labor and limiting work hours. There was also, over time, an expansion at the national level in who enjoyed political benefits. For instance, at this time, the early 20th century, the 17th Amendment was passed, which allowed for the popular election of senators and judges. Let me explain. Before the 17th Amendment, and the year I don't have, I'm sorry, but before the 17th Amendment, this is the early 20th century, United States senators were not elected by you and me. They were elected by members of the legislature of each state. So, in 1895, the two senators that were elected to the United States Senate from the state of New York were not elected by the people of the state of New York. They were elected indirectly by the people of New York. They elect the members up to go sit in Albany, and then those people elect the senators. It's complicated, it's indirect, and it's undemocratic. The 17th Amendment allowed you and I to directly elect our senators, giving them accountability to us. It also allowed for the election of judges, which is proven to be a bit problematic, because a judge's role is to determine the constitutionality of a law. But what if the law is unpopular to the people that elect him to his office as a judge? In Alabama last week, an elected state Supreme Court justice refused to accept that gay marriage was legal in Alabama. He just said, you don't have to follow this law. But it's a federal law. And he said, you don't have to follow it. And so what happened was a week of wrangling saying you can't do that. Federal law overtakes state law. But that was the most extreme example. All over the country, judges that are district attorneys. Let me give you a great example. The district attorney that was in charge of trying to get an indictment against a police officer who had choked Eric Garner in Staten Island with a chokehold. He failed to get an indictment, right? For a variety of reasons. Part of the reason was it would have been wildly unpopular to the people that elected him to his position, right? It's a very conservative neighborhood down there. You know what this district attorney is doing now? There was an opening at the U.S. House of Representatives. He's now running for that job. What I'm saying is, if you're in charge of enforcing and interpreting the law like you have an elected position, which came out of the progressive movement, it gets a little complicated with complicated laws. What else happened at the time that made America more democratic? Primaries. Does anybody here follow presidential politics? Nobody? Why not? Why not? It's fun stuff. It's not complicated.
It's very complicated.
Well, then you talk to me. I'll uncomplicate it for you. I'll uncomplicate it for you. Well, then you have to hold them accountable.
It takes a village. You can't do it alone.
Well, I'm not saying you got to take care of this on your own. I'm just saying, if you're throwing up your hands because you're disappointed, then why get out of bed in the morning, right? I'm disappointed every day. Why am I still smiling? Swimming. And Nutella. But let me move on. Primary elections. As you know, the next presidential election is 2016. But before the presidential elections, the Democratic and the Republican Party got to figure out who's going to be the guy or woman running on the Democratic or the Republican Party platform, correct? In the early 20th century, before the progressive movement, the leaders of each party got together in a closed door and they started bargaining, saying, I want this guy, well, I want this guy, all right, let's compromise, blah, 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 blah. And the people were left out of that process. The people got to vote for the candidate for office, but they didn't have any choice in who the candidate would be. Now we have primaries, where in every state the people elect, or they vote for who they want as their presidential candidate. And so there's this rather long period from January till about the summer where there's voting in every state, and at the end of it, each candidate counts up how many delegates they get, and they get to be the party's candidate. They get the most delegates, excuse me. Of course, women's suffrage was passed in 1920, drastically expanding democracy. But before I make it sound like everything is all fine and dandy, let me take a step back. At the same time that these progressives were saying more equality to the people, for workers, for women, for the poor, there was also a contraction or a shrinking of democracy, meaning the South. At the same period where women were becoming more organized in getting the vote, workers were getting more organized in getting the 8-hour workday, legalized unions, in the South, lynchings were going up. Blacks had lost the right to vote. There was no protection of their civil or economic liberties. Now, some of the more obvious advances made by women reformers outside of the vote took place at this time. Women progressive reformers were incredibly active, not just in organizing for the vote for women, but in organizing basic campaigns for poor people. Specifically the settlement houses in Chicago, that began in Chicago. The idea here was actually working, as you said, in the poor neighborhoods, building schools, building playgrounds, establishing health clinics to directly help the poor. The government's not doing it. These women's reformers were doing it on their own. And at this period, you see this upsurge of the suffrage movement, for the vote. All of this activity at the bottom eventually leads into presidential discussions. Theodore Roosevelt was the first progressive president. He took office in 1901 because the previous president, McKinley, was assassinated. He wasn't the first of our presidents to be assassinated. Johnson was, sorry. Lincoln was the first. But McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. Roosevelt took over. Who is Teddy Roosevelt? Teddy Roosevelt was once governor of New York. He was once police commissioner for New York City. He was born of an incredibly wealthy family out in Long Island. But he was one of these interesting, wealthy people in American history who grew up wealthy, grew up the elite, but felt, and not all wealthy people feel this way, you got to give something back. You've made this money, and that's wonderful, and that's great, but now it's time to give back. Serve in public office. Establish a foundation, a charity. You've got to give something back. So Roosevelt took office in 1901, and he immediately used the power of the presidency and all the sort of vague laws in the Constitution to do whatever he wanted. If you read the Constitution, it's pretty straightforward about when to have elections, how to veto something, and what the President, Congress, and the Supreme Court can do. Right? But, hello? Something wrong? We go before class. Well, go now, but we go before class. Now, prop that door open. Now, Roosevelt, as soon as he took office, he looked at the Constitution, he basically said, what about the stuff that I want to do that the Constitution doesn't specifically say I cannot do? What's stopping me from expanding the role of the presidential power? If it doesn't say don't do it in the Constitution, it's not illegal. And if you've read our Constitution, it's not that big of a document. You can read the whole thing in about half an hour. You could skim it in even less. At the time, Roosevelt said, well, I'm going to use the power of the presidency unlike anybody before me. Presidential power during wartime is pretty expansive. You will allow a president to do whatever they want during wartime. Roosevelt took the president's office and pretended like it was wartime and just started doing stuff. For instance, he went after the corporations. In 1904, he basically sued the Northern Securities Corporation. He sued them, took it all the way to Supreme Court, and broke up this major monopoly, saying you are too big, you control too much of the American economy, and that is bad for the American consumer. And they can't stop you, but I can. So he legally broke up a major monopoly. This was a group that was controlling railroad traffic in the West. He broke up the company because it was too big, it had too much power. When labor was starting to get involved against capital, getting unionized, in the past, governments would support the business. Roosevelt would step in, would defend the strikers, and would tell the corporations, you have to settle. This strike is bad for America. You're crippling coal production or steel production. Settle this strike. Give the workers something. In the past, presidents would close their eyes when the army would go in and destroy the strikes. Roosevelt defended the strikers. In 1906, he went nuts. In 1906, now that he got the feeling for regulating the economy, he had Congress pass a bunch of laws. In 1906, he started controlling the railway rates. What the populace wanted, he did. Government now started controlling the maximum price for railway freights. He passed a law that empowered the government to investigate how food and drugs are manufactured to make sure they were clean. There's a book by Sinclair Lewis called The Jungle. It is about poor people, I believe in Chicago, working in meat production plants, like slaughterhouses, where the meat comes in, they cut it up, they package it, they send it off to the stores, right? This novel was based on the real-life happenings in slaughterhouses that were not regulated. And what were they doing? Food was falling onto the ground, and it was being picked up and then packaged with other clean food. Food was infested with bacteria, and it was simply packaged and sent off to the stores. It was allowed to become too warm and rancid, and it was put in with regular meat, ground up and sent off to the store. Obviously, people got sick because there was no regulation. One of the big things that Roosevelt is known for was that he stepped in and he stopped the rampant deforestation of America. You had the mining companies, the railway companies, the forestry companies just destroying nature. Roosevelt established national parks throughout the country and said there has to be a limit to business. We have to keep trees. So some of the major national parks we have in this country, Yellowstone or Yosemite, which are gorgeous. I don't know, Google it, see some nice pictures. Or better yet, if you can, go. They're fantastic. They're absolutely fantastic. Roosevelt did that. He says, no, you cannot farm, mine, you cannot work on this land. It is for the people to enjoy. Now, you have to kick the Native Americans off that land in order to preserve it as a state park, or national park. So there is a downside to this. I don't want to sell Roosevelt as a great guy. William Howard Taft was the next of our progressive presidents. He was Roosevelt's hand-chosen successor. He also was very progressive. For instance, Standard Oil, huge corporation that controlled oil refinery and production across the country, controlled the economy. Taft went after them, sued them in Supreme Court, and broke them up in 1911. Tobacco. Big tobacco companies were destroying small tobacco farmers with their prices. He sued them too. And he forced them to regulate their pricing so that small tobacco farmers would not be wiped out. Roosevelt hated Taft after a while. He loved Taft when he helped him get elected, but he felt that Taft wasn't progressive enough. So he challenged Taft in 1912 as the Republican candidate for president. He lost. And so Roosevelt ran in 1912 as president under the Progressive Party platform. He took all these progressive notions and he made a party out of it. Yeah.
So he was only president for 3 years?
Who? Taft? Nope. 9 to 10, 10 to 11, 11 to 12. What am I missing? There's something wrong here. No. He finished off in the 12, and at the beginning of 13 is the switch over to the new president. It always confuses me as well. Always. In the election of 1912, you had 4 candidates. Roosevelt on the Progressive Party, Taft on the Republican Party, Eugene Debs as the Socialist Party candidate, and this guy, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. But even the Democratic Party started ingesting all of these progressive party ideas, or progressive ideas that said government's got to take care of things. Who was Woodrow Wilson? Governor of New Jersey. But before then, a history professor, or a political science professor at Princeton University. He was a scholar, and then he became a politician, which was both good and bad. Woodrow Wilson did not want to regulate the economy anymore. His platform was a little bit less aggressive than the Republicans and the progressives. But he believed, yes, the economy is destroying small business. It's destroying the workers. Somebody's got to do something. He essentially said, don't regulate the economy more, but make competition more fair. For instance, don't let corporations become monopolies. allow workers to unionize, encourage small business. In this way, you don't take away the freedom of big corporations, you just make it easier for everyone else to compete. Theodore Roosevelt ran as the Progressive Party platform, on the Progressive Party platform. He took everything that he believed in before, regulating the economy, regulating the corporations, but he went even further. He adopted the platform of the Progressive Party, which was the right for women to vote, national health laws and labor laws for women and children, the 8-hour workday as a national law, and health insurance, social insurance for workers and the poor and the unemployed. Roosevelt was asking for this stuff in 1912. We didn't get this stuff until 20 years later with the Great Depression. And healthcare, we didn't get it till 3 years ago. That's how ahead of his time Roosevelt was. Taft, the Republican, became more and more conservative and just said that business and the government should work together to try and benefit everybody. And then, of course, there was Eugene Debs, the socialist, and his platform was simple: capitalism bad. Elect me, I'll get rid of capitalism. Oh, yes. You elect me, and when elected, I will take over the banks and the railroads. And government will put together policies for the poor, the unemployed, etc., etc. Now, Woodrow Wilson won primarily because the Republican Party, which was the dominant party in America, was divided between Roosevelt and the once Republican president, Taft and the once Republican president Roosevelt. What happened when Wilson took office? He basically did everything that he said he wasn't going to do. He campaigned on, don't make the government bigger. He took office, and he made the government bigger. For instance, he passed a tariff immediately after taking office to reduce import duties. What does that mean? It means consumers should be allowed to buy products from overseas for cheaper prices, even if they're not made by Americans, because the consumer needs to have that kind of choice, which is against corporate interests. He also passed a graduated income tax. What does that mean? It means the more money you make, the higher your tax rate. And then that money will be used to make stuff for everybody else. Now, Wilson was very committed to protecting labor because he believed if you just make the workplace fair, it will. Wilson's belief was quite straightforward. Why would you go to work and work hard if you're going to get paid the same crappy wage no matter how hard you work? There's no motivation. But what if we make unions legal? Then you can bargain for higher wages and better work conditions. Then you have a motivation to work harder and better, and then everybody benefits. So he was a big proponent of protecting unions and limiting the right of corporations to exploit workers. For instance, corporations could only be so big, because the bigger they got, the more trouble they could cause because they had so much power. But there was no limits on unions. You can have 40 million members of your union, and he said that was legal, perfectly fine. Child labor. He started aggressively going after child labor and cutting it down. The 8-hour workday. He passed a law that says working on the railroads, where everybody worked longer than 8 hours, has got to stop. 8-hour workday on the railroads. And the banks. Sorry, back it up. Supervising the economy. This, you could really see that he had listened to the populists of the late 1800s. He created the Federal Reserve, which now is in charge of issuing currency and establishing rates on a national level from the government's perspective. It wasn't left to the banks. Remember the Populist Party platform you read for me? And they had those wacky ideas of minting silver, and the banks had to have less independent power. Well, come to Woodrow Wilson, president. They're not minting silver. But the notion that financial policy can't be in the hands of the banks, it's got to be in the hands of the government, elected and responsible to the people, is now a reality. And in 1914, he created the Federal Trade Commission. This was a national body charged with investigating unfair business practices and correcting them. This is a far cry from the Gilded Age. Remember that writing by Graham Sumner you read for me that said there should be no regulation on the economy at all? Woodrow Wilson is now putting in place laws that are completely different. Regulate everything to protect the common person. So where does this leave us? By 1916, the government is heavily into the business of regulating the economy, business practices, financial policy. It has now got rules that provide protection for labor, food inspection, drug inspection, working conditions, basically making life a little bit easier for poor people. But, there's always a but. All of this progressivism, the government helping out poor people, remember, Wilson is a Democrat. You remember what part of the country the Democrats are the strongest in? The South. Wilson is a president. He doesn't make the laws, he enforces the laws, which means he's got to get the Democrats in Congress to introduce the law and vote for his reform laws. Now, Wilson was no liberal, he was no Abe Lincoln, but even if Wilson wanted to introduce a law that would reform Jim Crow tactics in the South and protect blacks' voting rights, even if he wanted to do that, he couldn't do it because he needed Southern Democratic votes to pass all this reform legislation. And this was the same problem Franklin Delano Roosevelt would have in the 1930s. And by the way, a lot of Republicans were racist too. They weren't going to vote for stuff if it was associated with civil liberties for blacks. That would take time. So this is not me saying that everything sucks, so why pay attention? This is me saying we improve in stages. And while a lot of good happened at this time for a lot of people, a lot of other people did not improve, specifically in the South. I am done. 1 minute over. I apologize. But now you have everything you need from Chapter 18. Go ahead.
So why, before we have